This is a historical plan in Shanghai aiming to rebuild a city center on the periphery, and it was not successful. It didn't come true for very complicated historical reasons. And let me provide this sort of like historical backdrop of these. From the title, we can tell that that is a grand plan and about the peripheral centrality. In the Shanghai, of course, is China's primary city, but in the Chinese urban system, it's a young city because it became a modern city, sort of like accidentally because of the historical event, because of the Treaty of Nanking, and as a result of the Opium War and the British invasion, and so the Chinese army was invaded, was defeated by the British invasion as a result of that historical occurrence. And the part of the Treaty of Nanking, Shanghai was opened by force to foreign trade, and so that was very genesis, the beginning of Shanghai as a modern city. Very, very short history. So ever since then, actually, Shanghai is a dual city, and there is a Chinese Shanghai and foreign Shanghai, and for nearly 1 century. So the focus of my presentation and my paper was on the Chinese effort of planning a different Shanghai in contrast to the foreign Shanghai. And the existence of this foreign Shanghai was based upon the foreign settlements, and there are plenty of architectural and legacies, and they are in Shanghai today, and mostly in the Banda area. So I'm not going through the details, and using these maps, I just want to show that Shanghai Center, as we know it today, was, in great part built upon the original colonial center. So this was also why the plan, the focus of this presentation, the Greater Shanghai Plan, that was not successful. So all of those foreign concessions lasted for 1 century, laying the foundation of the urban form, morphology, and the centrality of the city. As we have, of course, the Shanghai CBD has expanded and to include the Pudong new area, and as the image and shows that it's very modern. That's but the old center and the new center, they converge into the Shanghai CBD as it is today. So the broad historical backdrop of this plan was Shanghai as a dual city, a foreign Shanghai and a Chinese Shanghai, involving the administration, the urban development, of course, and the planning, thinking, and the planning mechanism. Okay, so the centrality of Shanghai in the 1920s to 30s, and was a foreign Shanghai. So the foreign Shanghai and the Chinese Shanghai were different, or even in contrast in many dimensions, and housing, and legal system, and all of those. Let me see. All of this, the built environment and the social organization and the political systems. So Shanghai came into a sort of like golden age of development in the 1920s. So those rapid capitalist development driven by the foreign investment and international trade. So won Shanghai a reputation as the Paris of the Orient. So at that time, Shanghai already had a 4 million population, and it was in the same rank as London, New York, Chicago, Paris, and Tokyo at the time. So the overall background of that, the the centrality of the whole, a modern and international, economic center, mostly based upon the foreign concessions, as we could tell from the architecture and styles of the time, and they're still there in the Banda area today. So behind what we have observed in Shanghai in 1920s and 30s, and as manifested by those foreign investment and architecture and urban form expressions, there was another, a drive of Chinese planning that was to re-centralize Greater Shanghai, to be away from or to compete, or ultimately to win back the foreign concessions. So the earliest planning imagination was proposed by Sun Yat-sen and the Chinese nationalist revolutionary and the first president of the People's Republic of China. And in 1920, when he was ousted from the presidency by warlords, he stayed in Shanghai and he produced a international development scheme, a grand development scheme of China. This included a plan for Shanghai, and he was the first political leader to redevelop the Pudong and to rebuild a civic center, and we could tell that he imagined or into a New York City, and his plan was too grand and to be implementable, given China was not even united at the time, and his plan greatly relied on foreign and international investment. But his vision of redeveloping or re-centralizing Shanghai and to compete, and the foreign concessions greatly influenced the subsequent Greater Shanghai plan, as I'm going to talk now. So the Greater Shanghai Plan, 1927-37, it was an effort to re-centralize Shanghai and on the periphery. And why it happened in 1927? Because in that year, the nationalist government united China loosely and nominally, and because the whole nation was not truly united, because there were warlords, foreign existence, and the communist army and revolutionaries, etc. So sort of like national unification underpinned some sort of like a real serious planning, imagining of China's primary city. So the central government established in Nanking at the time, they established Shanghai as a special municipality and delimiting an area of around 500 square kilometers. Ever since then, Shanghai was a special municipality in the Chinese governance system. And Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the national leader at the time, he attended the ceremony of establishing Shanghai as a special municipality. And from his remarks, again, we could tell that the central aim of building a Shanghai and planning a new Shanghai, including a new city center, was to differentiate from and to compete with the foreign concessions, the existing established foreign center of the city. So the plan lasted for 10 years in terms of plan making and implementation on and off, and because as I said, China was not truly united at the time, and the political turmoils and the wars with the Japanese army and the mostly, and the central government didn't have the sort of like financial capacity to implement the grand plan. The key point of this grand plan was, as the map shows, was to build a new city center on the periphery, And at that time, and that area was largely rural and undeveloped, and so it was intentionally away from the foreign concession and the old city center to build a new city center or new civic center simply from scratch. So this plan, the notion of centrality was different from Sun Yat-sen's the plan of building a Oriental New York City, but the driving thinking behind the whole imagining was sort of like a similar, very nationalistic and very imaginative and bold vision to build a new center and on the periphery. So I'm not going through the details of plan making phases, and the plan had to the plan making and the implementation had to be terminated because in 1937 the Japanese army and occupied the whole city, including the international the foreign concessions by the British and the Americans, because after the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. So this was the focus of the plan, to build a new civic center and on the periphery. And so this was truly a combination of both the Chinese planning and architecture expression and the Western thinking. And so the urban form, the urban structure followed the Chinese character, zhong, that means, it literally means center, and it also literally means China. So radiating out in four directions and along four artery roads. And those roads were named by those political slogans of the nationalist government then: 3 people's principles, 5 rights, and 1 world, the sort of like nationalist political doctrine proposed by Sun Yat-sen. And there was a Chinese lofty pagoda in the center. It followed the very traditional Chinese urban structure of south-north directions and some kind of like feng shui principles as well. And it was also heavily influenced by the modernist urban planning thinking at the time, and the City Beautiful movement, and we could tell some sort of like elements of similar plans elsewhere in those planned cities, like the Washington, New Delhi, including certain notions of Haussmann's Paris. So indeed, as we could tell from the city center plan, that was a combination of the Chinese and the Western planning thinking. So it was not surprising if we further find out who are the planners that I'm going to talk in a while. So as I just said, in the whole plan making had to stop in 1937 because of the war, and by then, the whole grand plan largely remained in maps and drawings, and the whole plan was never, collected into one sort of like a document, or maybe, those complete documents simply did not happen at all, and so they were very sporadic and in different fires and etc. And by then, several government buildings were designed and implemented, and they were still there today in Shanghai, in the Tongji University, in the surrounding area. And so from this architectural style, you could tell that they're very Chinese, and followed a sort of like Chinese Renaissance style, a combination of the traditional Chinese style symbolically and architecturally, and at the same, and meanwhile they incorporate this sort of like modern comforts. So this kind of like architecture and explicit Chinese architecture reminds people of the grandiose vision and the very nationalistic aspiration of a sort of like a cultural pride to intentionally differentiate from those, Western architecture as we could still observe today in the Banda area. So those kind of like buildings are still there today, and government buildings, library, and the museum, even though their uses today are different and they're well preserved as a sort of like historical preservation. Okay, as I just said that, this sort of like combination of Chinese and Western planning, thinking, and architecture, and not surprising, and if we read the backgrounds of the key planners in the Great Shanghai Plan, and those Chinese planners, they were very young at the time, in 20s and even early 30s. And they had this sort of like opportunity to be involved in this kind of like grand plan making. But they were all educated in Europe or America. And, Shanghai was the government planner in charge of the whole plan making. And he was a Germany trained and engineer, and a Dai Yudong, and the architect of those of most of this sort of like buildings. And he was educated from University of Minnesota, and Chao Shen, and a graduate from University of Pennsylvania. So they were, this sort of like Chinese elite planners and architects, and who were trained overseas. And the whole planning making process were also advised and by foreign experts, including American planner and a German planner, and also the Karl Bransky, and he used to be the president of the Society of American Civil Engineers. So Sheng Yi's memoir, and he in his memoir he recalled his role as the commissioner of the Public Works Bureau, which oversaw the plan as of extreme constructiveness and political meaning, and given he was very young in late 20s, or if not and early 30s, it's a bold effort of entering the society. So this part of the planning history in China was very moving and touchy, and in the nation's earliest planning efforts, because the Great Shanghai Plan was China's first modern city plan, and it was a pioneer in China's urban planning, modern planning. Even though it was not truly fully implemented, and it had to stop, and but it had significant professional and cultural legacies of modern planning, not only in the city but also in the nation, and in mainland China as well as Taiwan, China, as the Sheng Yi and the government planner in charge of the whole project. He moved to Taiwan after the 1949. So the whole plan making process, the rationale behind the whole planning thinking was truly embodied what Shanghai was about at the time, the Chinese and the Western, and the combination of both rationalism and idealism. And for those young planners and designers, there was a very strong optimism and nationalism and behind the whole drive, and they expect to build a new democratic, free new China through building a new city, and a new as reflected in those notions in the civic center. So, and it was indeed a combination, of the Western thinking and the Chinese traditional thinking, as we could tell from those urban structure and the architectural expressions of those civic buildings. And more importantly, if we look at the whole effort from a longer historical perspective, we could tell that this Greater Shanghai Plan probably was the first, articulation of a city making and a nation building, and that was actually explicit attribute of Chinese planning and urbanization probably until today. And we could trace the thematic trend from Shanghai and the Pudong in 1990s and Shenzhen in 1980s, and the latest Xiong'an and city experiment. There is a sort of like historical theme linking all of those efforts together, articulating the city making and the nation building. They're about planning a city, but it's more than about planning a city. It's truly about building a nation and modernization of a nation behind the whole thing. Aligning to the theme of this seminar, and so this was a historical effort, and a historical effort of re-centralizing a city on the periphery, but given the historical context and other factors and the political turmoils, more importantly the wars, etc., and it was unfulfilled. And as we could tell that today the civic center area was urbanized, but Shanghai as a city is the central CBD area remained to be centered around the old city center established during the colonial period. That's from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Richard. That was wonderful, and I keep reminiscing of having walked along those areas in Shanghai and trying to now figure out what would have happened if, which is an interesting question, of course, for all of the historical papers that we've heard today, which is something we might take up methodologically, maybe at the end or in another context. I also again see echoes here of Stephen Logan's work on both Prague in the modern period and modern Toronto, where similar mixes of influences came into the mix. And then Walter made the observation that it reminds him of Finland, where also I assume that you have people like Alvar Aalto and others in mind, who integrated, of course, other forms of modernism and other forms of regionalism into the modern project, which the modern city. So just to take up some of the threads from the chat, but it's open now, and if anybody wants to comment, ask Richard questions, you're very welcome. Nick, please.
Just more of a comment or a reflection. Lots of really interesting connections to be made from Richard's talk. I think maybe a couple that occurred to me is just the history of individuals, interesting individuals, people. That sort of micro level of history, which we perhaps we kind of forget about as well. People, influential people, can be quite important in urban projects, and they're visible and apparent and active, or have been in the suburbs. In this case, in the case of Berwick Metro Town, even with those consultants, often internationally conversant, connected. So interesting, the role of individuals rather than sort of grand sweeps of structures in history, often overlooked, but there's probably a story there in itself about the role of key individuals in sort of even in some of these sort of lost and past examples. And I suppose the other thing is really thinking about the urban policy mobilities literature. I guess the key is in that expression, urban policy mobilities, that the focus is very much on city centres, the extant city, ignoring the extent to which imagination for the suburbs, the actual building of some suburbs, has evidenced this kind of process of policy transfer, cross-fertilization of ideas, etc. So those are just a couple of things that kind of kept coming across my mind when I was listening to Richard's talk. I'm sure we'll come across them again with some of the other presentations as well.
Yeah, and I had that same thought about policy mobility and the mobility of ideas in Walter's comparative cases. How do the state lines get crossed in terms of how ideas move around? That's, of course, also for the Melbourne case. And so that's a theme that is developing in comparative suburban research. How do ideas get around? And of course, a lot, in North America has to do with here in Toronto, but also all over the United States with exiles from Nazi Germany who were revolutionary or modern architects and had to leave Germany and ended up in Los Angeles like Neutra and others, and changed the way the United States or Canada and Australia also as a recipient of those exiles changed, and China, of course, also, changed the way we envisioned these cities in mid-century. Walter.
So my question was about kind of mobility within China, especially in recent years. In the last maybe 20 years, how have the kind of ideas that we see in Shanghai moved to other parts of China in the argument about building nationally and the kind of building greatness for the future of the Chinese society? How have these discussions, I think a lot about Guangzhou and then the immigrant communities there. And so I wanted to see kind of from your perspective, Professor, what's happening in this discussion across the country, not just in Shanghai.
I think in the recent decade that there was a strong reflection and about the westernized approach. And as we could tell from the urban landscape in Pudong and Shenzhen. And but if we look at the latest Xiong'an experiment, and the focal theme was it must be a Chinese approach to the future urbanization. So I think that's sort of like a Western dominated thinking, and Western planners and designers, and that golden age, and has been gone.
That's a very, very strong point. And so we come from comparative policy mobility to maybe Ananya Roy's interreferencing in parts of the world that didn't tend to be seen as the idea givers, but more as the idea recipients. And then now, of course, the majority urban world, as somebody like Abdul Malik Simon will call it. Anybody else still ready for a comment or a question?
I'll ask just a quick question.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Just looking at I suppose the governance complexity that surrounded Shanghai, both in terms of spatial terms and then the various governance institutions that were involved in things. Was that a factor in the plan's ultimate demise, basically, in that there were all these tectonic governance plates pulling against one another?
No, because actually the nationalist government seemed to get pretty get along with the English and the French and existence, because they were allies in World War I and World War II, and the plan was demised because of the biggest factor was the Japanese invasion, and that leading to the World War II.